They say the state is the duty bearer when it comes to education. And of course, we as Christians do not believe that. We believe parents are the duty bearers. That's what the Bible teaches. But they said, how do we get control of all these non-state education providers? And their solution was very simple. We will offer them free money, and then once they take the free money, we will tell them what to do.
Welcome back to Season 2 of the Colorado Homeschool Podcast. And remember, we're doing this interviewing experts, homeschool families, graduates, all because we want to help you find the confidence to homeschool. We know you can do it. We think that this is an amazing journey. Our conversation today is going to be, I hope, inspiring for you. We're talking about the dangers that are presented to the homeschool freedom movement right now, but not just that, but the solutions and how we can navigate that with confidence. So hang on. I think you're going to love this. Well, welcome back. We are so thrilled to have you with us today. We have a treat, guys. We have Alex Newman. He is, to say what he's involved in is going to take us more than we have time on our podcast, but let me just summarize. He's the president of Liberty Sentinel Media. Did I say that right?
Liberty Sentinel Media, yeah.
Liberty Sentinel Media. I don't know why that's a tongue twister to me. He's an author. He's an advocate. He's very involved in lots of fights to protect our children and our liberties. He's written 3 books. We're going to talk about one new release coming up on education specifically, but authored many other books. He's been a part of many major media news sources, Fox News, Newsweek, Chronicle, Epic Times, all of these. So we are definitely in for a treat. We're not only going to get to talk to Alex Newman today, I hope you join us in April for our day at the Capitol, because Alex is our keynote speaker then. And guys, grab your pen right now, share this with your friends, because I think you're going to be super encouraged, super inspired, and just realize how important this time that we live in. So thank you, Alex, for being here. Welcome.
It's a great honor to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm so thrilled. Well, let's just start by talking about the book that's coming out. We're recording this in January. It's just coming out. We're going to air this a little bit later, but you are releasing a book with Robert Borton, Woke and Weaponized. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. So Robert, of course, is the CEO of Classical Conversations, where I serve as a senior fellow. And he and I have been working on education issues together for some time. And we realized there was no book out there that really told the story of how we got into this mess, and also explained why some of the so-called solutions may not actually be solutions, may actually get us deeper into trouble. We realized there was nothing out there like that. And so we decided somebody has to do it, and there's nobody doing it, so I guess it's going to need to be us. So what we tried to do with the book, we start off at the very beginning, right? Like, how did it come to be that the government became the primary educator for the vast majority of American children? Who were the people involved in this? What did they believe? What did they say their objectives were? And I'm telling you, people are going to be shocked when you realize that the people who built this system didn't actually have the best education for your children in mind, but actually had alternative motives, in some cases very nefarious alternative motives. You see that we're dealing with a whole different kind of problem than at first we think we're dealing with. So we trace that history. We start off with a guy called Robert Owen. He was the first guy in our country and really in Western history that seriously proposed that the government ought to be educating children, and that they ought to be doing it in this particular way. And so he outlined his vision. He was waging war on what he called the great trinity of evil, being marriage, family, private property, and religion, in particular Christianity. He had it out against Christianity. So he kind of laid the groundwork, and then that was picked up later by some other characters, again, very nefarious, people like John Dewey, a guy who was in love with the Soviet system. And so we trace all that history. We show how we got here. We show what education looked like before these people got their hands on it. It turns out it was pretty amazing, actually. And then we get into, all right, we have a huge problem. What do we do with this? And so we actually spend quite a bit of time talking about the school choice issue, which is something that unfortunately not a lot of people have touched.
Right. Yes. And we talked about this a little bit before we started, the school choice issue. I feel like it's just like most of the political battles, it's a definition problem, because what I define as school choice is not what the school choice movement of today is really about. Because I'm all for school choice. We want that independence and that freedom. So what do you see as the problem with that? Or do you agree? Do you think it is a definition? It's defining the terms in different ways so people are not all understanding the underlying, maybe unintended consequences for some and intended, as you just mentioned, for others.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right about the issue of definition. School choice, I think every sensible person who values liberty and God-given rights wants school choice. We want parents to be able to decide how the children will be educated, and therefore we must have choice. But unfortunately, the school choice movement, the official school choice movement, if you will, means something very different. They're talking about government-funded and ultimately government-regulated choice. And that really is no choice at all. When the government becomes we understood this when it came to healthcare. I mean, people still remember the battles over single payer, right? Why don't we want single payer? Well, because then that single payer, being the government, will control all the choices. And so that's really the issue. So, I personally am pleased that we're now having this discussion, because the discussion has moved from how do we reform this system to how do we focus on getting more children out of a system that's really not working for parents. And so that's good. I think that's positive that we're moving the conversation in that direction. But with all due respect to our friends and our loved ones on the other side of this issue, we need to understand that when government money gets involved, government control will inevitably follow. This is what we have seen in jurisdiction after jurisdiction that's moved in this direction. And so, we took on the uncomfortable task of trying to explore this. We looked at who are some of the billionaires funding this movement. I think people are going to be surprised. Bill Gates, one of the biggest financiers of the so-called school choice movement. So I think it's really critical, as you pointed out, that we've got to define our terms properly. We believe that parents have the right to choose what is the best kind of education for their children to receive. But we're very skeptical of the idea that government should be funding everybody's choices because inevitably that will lead to government control.
Yeah, it's actually Leah Borton from Classical Conversations that says, with the shekels come the shackles. And that is, man, it feels like a mantra that I say all the time, but I can't tell you how many times. Why do you think this conversation gets so emotionally volatile? Because it immediately turns to, you're so legalistic. There's insults immediately when I'm having conversations, particularly with homeschool group leaders that are like, well, I'm going to take the money from this funding because it's taxpayer dollars and I paid these tax. I mean, the argument goes on and on. Do you have a perspective of that maybe would help our listeners understand why it feels so emotional, but how do we separate ourselves from that?
Yeah, it's very hard to compete against free money and free stuff generally. And the people who put in place these kinds of policies understand that free money speaks very, very loudly and oftentimes will override people's moral principles. Oftentimes it will override pragmatic concerns about possible future regulation. They say, well, I can take the money now and the controls aren't that bad. And so in the future, if more controls come, then I can re-examine this, which, by the way, is exactly what a lot of hospitals said when the government started offering free money. Oh, we're a Catholic hospital. We're a Lutheran hospital. But the government's not requiring too much. Let's just start taking the money. And before you know it, the government says jump, and every hospital says how high, Master, whether it be on COVID mandates or whatever the case may be. And so this is actually a strategy that was laid out by the UN. Several years ago, the UNESCO, the UN's education agency, which, speaking of nefarious motives when it comes to education, that's a whole nother can of worms. They put out the Global Education Monitoring Report, where they explored what they view as a problem. They call them non-state education providers or non-state actors providing education. They view that as a problem to be solved. They say the state is the duty bearer when it comes to education. And of course, we as Christians do not believe that. We believe parents are the duty bearers. That's what the Bible teaches. But they said, how do we get control of all these non-state education providers? And their solution was very simple. We will offer them free money, and then once they take the free money, we will tell them what to do. We will impose curricula on them. We will impose testing on them. And so that is their plan. They've told us that is their plan, and we've seen that plan executed in places like Sweden. My wife is from there, so I was actually living there when all of this happened. They had passed they use the same terminology, school choice, and it'll be like a backpack. The money will follow a child. They're very compelling arguments until you really think about them through a biblical lens. And then we were there in 2010 when the trapdoor closed. They said all of the private schools that are taking government money must teach the government curriculum, must not have Bible, must not have prayer, must follow all the regulations. At that point, all the private schools except one were taking the government money. And for good measure, they went ahead and banned homeschooling in that same piece of legislation. So I have seen this happen. I've seen the government ripping children out of the arms of families for homeschooling in defiance of the government after the school choice trap closed. So I think we've got to think about this through a biblical lens. Is it the role of government to be giving us free money or taking money from our neighbors and giving it to us? And it's hard to argue against free money, but it's still important that we make the case.
Yeah, and you're right. It is hard to argue against it without, and I find again that the argument is always emotional, that people just take personal offense and they're like, well, this is my conviction, that's your conviction, and let it go. So can you help us? Maybe do you have any points that you would point to help somebody understand that narrative of why is it a biblical mandate, or besides the anecdotal? And by the way, I've heard that talking about what happened in another country, and they're like, well, that would never happen in America. It's a different government system. And I hear that. So do you have a response to that? I just asked you 2 questions, but
yeah, it is happening in America. It absolutely is happening in America. And all you have to do is look at the legislation that has passed and look at the calls for regulation as soon as these school choice programs pass. Virtually every state that I have looked at has included at least some regulations and controls on recipients of the money, even the gold standard states of Arizona and Florida. I'm in Florida. I watched what happened in Arizona. And what happened is, as soon as the money became available, some controls went on to the recipients. And now you might say, well, those controls aren't enough to make me not want to take the money. Okay, but that's a separate issue. The point is there were controls attached to the money. And really, I think you made a really important point here. We have to look at this from a biblical lens as Christians. That is our guide, and that is our standard. And I always challenge people, what part of the Bible, what chapter and verse do you think authorizes the state to be overseeing the education of my children? That's ultimately not the government's job. The government clearly in the scriptures is instituted by God for the punishment of evil and the restraining of sin. Again, Romans 13 speaks very clearly to this. The government is not there to take stuff from your neighbors and give it to you. If you read Frederick Bastiat's The Law, he was a brilliant French philosopher, economist, and lawmaker. He actually explains that it is immoral to try to use the state to take things that you covet from your neighbor, whether that's money or anything else. And just because you're getting an intermediary to do it for you, just because you're not like literally walking over to your house and demanding money for the education of your children, doesn't make it any less respectable. And ultimately, we as parents are called to take on the responsibility of discipling our children, and that's very important. As the Moms for Liberty like to say, we don't co-parent with the government, and I think it's more important than ever that we really draw that line in the sand and say, no, this is the family responsibility. The family's not going to go out there and arrest bad guys, but we will be in charge of the education of our children. You stay in your lane, we'll stay in ours.
Right. And that is exactly it. Boy, I feel like, I've talked to a lot of teachers and school leaders and school board members, and they are just swearing up and down, no, this doesn't happen. All these things happening in the school, but it is a slow fade where we've all sort of been indoctrinated into this idea of compulsory school. And this is what we've always done, so we should always do it. And it makes me think of, it's the ridiculous argument that teenagers would give. Well, everybody else is doing it. And that's kind of where we've gotten to, right? Where everybody else is doing it. So why can't I? So I'm on a mission to try to help these parents avoid taking the funds, because you're right. That's the argument that we hear all the time. When you take it, well, right now there's no strings attached. And then when they start doing things I don't like, then I'll just stop doing it. But the damage is already done. Can you think of some other, secondary issues? What damage does that cause?
Well, there's a philosophical and a moral problem here too, right? Once the government starts paying for the education of your children, you are handing over a huge amount of the responsibility for that education to the state. And is that really what we ought to be doing? And there's of course the practical problem too, is that once they hit a critical mass, it's much easier to bring in those controls, like we saw in Sweden. Once they have everybody on board, or most everybody, becomes very easy. So I've been very disheartened that we're seeing this kind of fracture in the homeschooling movement. I mean, for decades, the homeschooling community remembered the battles that we fought to be able to have homeschool freedom. And the rallying cry was, we don't want the government involved in the education of our children. Now we're moving into this new phase where we say, well, we do want the government involved in the education of our children. We do want the government to at least pay for that. And of course, that's very problematic. And I challenge people to think about this from the other perspective. Do we really want, because we say, well, there's not going to be regulation, there's not going to be control, is an argument we hear frequently. Well, let's assume for a moment that's true, which of course it's not, but let's assume for a moment that it's true. What do we do then when the state is funding Islamic madrasas, indoctrination centers that teach maybe certain violent jihadist doctrines? What do we do when people are teaching paganism or Satanism? Is that something that we want our tax dollars funding? What about, to highlight something that's come up in Arizona? Families are building swimming pools under the guise of, teaching swimming lessons to their children. Parents are going on field trips to Paris. So it's a field trip for our school. How do we as taxpayers feel about our money being used in those ways? And of course, we don't want that to happen. So we do want some controls. We don't want our money to be handed out willy-nilly with no accountability and no controls, because it leads to all sorts of abuses, as the people in Minnesota are learning right now, right?
Right, exactly.
So these are important issues.
They are important issues. So how do you, as just a regular homeschool mom, and we talk about this all the time, like, we are only called to do what God has asked us to do. And some people are called to do big things, and some people are called to do seemingly small things, but they're significant because we're called to do it. So the regular mom and dad that has decided we're going to homeschool, what can they do to resist this tide? And, are you calling people to join the voice? Is it a matter of like, hey, helps educate others? Because there is this narrative that's going around, redefining language and changing it, and really vilifying any opposite view, which is the worst debate tactic. But what would you say to them? Like, just mom and dad?
Yeah, I think we all have an obligation to get involved here, both on what's going on in the government schools. And I know some people in the homeschool community sometimes get frustrated with me, like, well, what do we care what's happening in the government schools? Like, it's not our problem. We've got our children safe in the homeschool, and, we don't have to worry about that. We do have to worry about that. Those are our future neighbors, the future spouses of our children, the future voters who are going to make the political decisions in this country, future corporate leaders. And there's really an element here of loving our neighbor too. The government's own data shows that less than 1 in 3 of the children in government schools is even proficient in any core subject. I mean, if we love our neighbors, how can we be okay with them being turned into illiterates who can't do basic math, who think they were born in the wrong body and that castration is a solution, that think they're a cat and need a litter box? We can't knowingly and willingly tolerate that kind of stuff without at least expressing our disagreement, without at least being on record that, we don't consent to that. We're not okay with that. And I think there's also, societal implications. If these trends continue, if we don't deal with them, it's going to lead to catastrophe. And even from a selfish perspective, our children are going to be dealing with the aftermath of this. I don't think a civilization can long continue with the kinds of things that are happening through what passes for education. So these are battles that we all need to get involved in, even though, we would rather not. We'd rather just do our own thing and homeschool in our own world. I understand that. I understand the temptation to that. And you're right. God didn't call every single person to get actively involved in every fight. I mean, we can't. But as the body of Christ, God has called all of us to do at least whatever part he has assigned to us, with one body with different members and different functions. But these are battles that are really, really, really critical. The future of the next generation, the future of our state, the future of the country. And we have to be involved. We have to be sounding the alarm. I often use the analogy of a burning building. If the building is on fire and there are children inside, yes, you need to immediately rescue your own children from the burning building. But what kind of person would you be if you just let all the other children in there burn up without saying anything? So
I love that analogy. Yes, I want it to be more accessible. I think homeschooling is accessible and anybody can do it. But then I just hear, we live in Colorado. It's quickly becoming a very expensive place to live. And the two income thing, and there's so many objections to homeschooling. I do think that it's a matter of priorities and reassessing what you're paying for. But how do you see your hand even in that, or are you just mostly focused on like, hey, stay away from the government? But what is your answer to that accessibility question? The like, it costs too much, I can't afford to not work, or XYZ.
Well, Robert and I actually addressed that toward the end of the new book, Woke and Weaponized. And it's something that I personally have dealt with. When my wife and I moved to the United States from overseas, we were obviously on one income, mine. It was very small. So we lived in a very small house, and we ate, humble food, a lot of rice and beans, maybe a little more than I would have liked. We drove one old car. And so it is a matter of priorities. I hear people say that they don't think they can afford it, and they step outside and they've got a 2-year-old BMW. They're driving to their 4,000 square foot house, getting ready to go on their ski vacation. Where are your priorities at? And so I sometimes get frustrated with that. There are a lot of resources out there as well. There are, of course, folks who are genuinely in need. They're single moms. But we had the privilege of serving a single mom early on when we moved here. Her husband had run off, and so she did not want the children to go to a government school. So my wife stepped in and helped with the homeschooling 1 or 2 days a week. Grandma stepped in and helped with the homeschooling 1 or 2 days a week, and mom could go, do her job as a nurse, and it worked out real well. So where there's a will, there's a way. You don't need the government to help you. And there's a lot of programs, like Classical Conversations has a scholarship fund. The Freedom Project Academy has a scholarship fund. The Homeschool Legal Defense Association has a scholarship fund.
Right.
Maybe your church has one, and if it doesn't, it should. We should be, as Christians, stepping in to help those in need within the flock. And there's a lot of ways to do it, but it's about priorities. It's about Christians coming together, and it's about using voluntary means rather than bringing the government into the education system.
I want to go a little bit backwards, talking about, we mentioned the word already, indoctrination, but that was one of the books you wrote last year, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. And what are you seeing? Culturally, I feel like turn the news on in any major city, we're seeing the results of that. But what are the implications? It sounds like you're maybe talking about some of that in this new book as well.
Yeah, and what's happening in the school system to try to avoid sugarcoating it is, the children are being systematically dumbed down. They are being indoctrinated to believe not just bad ideas, but anti-biblical, very dangerous ideas that have terrible consequences, consequences that we've seen over and over again throughout human history in countries that fell to communism, countries that fell to Nazism, countries that fell into absolute degeneracy. And this is objectively true. Everybody tries to rationalize, well, it's not happening in my district, or Aunt Sally.
Everybody says that. Yes.
Right. It's happening across the country. In fact, people think we now have a national system. We really have an international system of education. Doctrines of demons are being taught as fact, as truth. This is coming down all the way from the international level with UNESCO, the UN's education agency. And it is it's having catastrophic consequences on our society. I mentioned the government's data showing that less than 1 in 3 American children in the public schools are proficient in anything. Something
crazy.
It is. And we pay $250,000 by the time a child goes from K through 12 in taxpayer money, and they come out, they literally can't read their high school diploma, many of them. And I mean that literally, like they cannot read the words on their high school diploma. So now they're just getting rid of the tests entirely in some states so that nobody has to know that you can't read or do basic math. And part of it too is the effect it's having on our churches. For pastors, we've got data suggesting that something like 80% of children from Christian homes who spend 12 years in the public school system are going to leave the faith. They're going to leave the church. Your congregations will be decimated by this. And so, for me as a Christian dad, there is nothing more important to me, nothing in the world than that my children grow up knowing, fearing, honoring the Lord, and walking with him. And of course, I can't control that as a parent, right? I'm not Jesus. Jesus saves our children, not parents. But following his instructions, Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 11, Ephesians 6:4, Proverbs 22, I mean, you could go on and on. Following his instructions produces fruit. And I think we need to be faithful to that, especially when we realize what is happening out in the world. It's bad.
Yeah, it is. But I love homeschooling. To me, it's like the hope, and seeing families and individual people making a difference. And it's George Barna came to our homeschool conference and shared statistics that were just heartbreaking about the church, basically what we're seeing. But he ended with, after saying about 4% of the American church is actually a biblical disciple, he ended with a statement that is just so encouraging. And this is how I see homeschooling, is that God is, the entire Bible is God using the remnant to
Amen.
change the world. And so homeschool families hear that. You're the remnant. Be faithful in that. So neglected this in the bio, but Alex and his wife are homeschool family. You maybe gathered that, but they have 6 children. And we love to close every interview that we're doing with asking, what is your best homeschool tip? So do you have a tip that you would like to leave us with, Alex?
Well, we over 15 years of homeschooling, we've developed quite a few ideas. One thing that I would really recommend to people who are able is to be involved in co-ops and go out into the world and do stuff. Doing
Nice.
exploring, traveling, field trips, doing actual work, fixing engines, rounding up cattle. We've been conditioned to believe that education can only happen sitting at a desk.
It's so silly. Yeah.
It is. It really is. And I think homeschoolers are rediscovering that education isn't just what we do at the dining room table when we're opening our school books. It's really what we're doing all the time. And so, that would be my advice. And for those non-homeschoolers who might be listening to us, try it. It's amazing. You'll never go back.
It's so true. It is not what you expect, but it's so good. So, well, Alex, thank you. This was a delight. We can't wait to see you in person at our day at the Capitol, and we really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you. God bless you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for joining us today. The Colorado Homeschool Podcast is a ministry of Christian Home Educators of Colorado. We have been motivating parents to disciple the next generation by embracing home discipleship that is Christ-centered, parent-directed, and free from government control. We invite you to join us in this mission. If you want to support homeschooling in Colorado, go to CHEC.org/donate. In the meantime, share this with your friends and make sure you subscribe. That really helps us. Thank you.
Brought to you by thepodcastupload.com, empowering faith-driven voices.